Today's briefing focuses on what intelligence sources describe as one of the most urgent geopolitical developments of 2026. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's unscheduled emergency flight to Washington, D.C., reportedly triggered by leaked intelligence that President Trump has already issued final authorization for comprehensive military strikes against Iran, scheduled to commence within 24 hours. According to multiple classified assessments that have reached this analysis, Netanyahu departed Tel Aviv aboard the wing of Zion aircraft in an emergency capacity, abandoning scheduled domestic commitments and convening his security cabinet via secure communications during the flight. This is not routine diplomatic consultation. This is not standard coordination between allied governments. This represents a crisis intervention where Israel's leadership has learned that the United States is proceeding with imminent military action, and Netanyahu is racing to Washington to influence final operational parameters before American forces initiate combat operations that will fundamentally reshape the Middle East strategic landscape. The significance of this emergency flight cannot be overstated. When a sitting Israeli prime minister abandons domestic schedules for unplanned international travel, it signals crisis-level developments requiring immediate personal intervention at the highest levels. The leaked intelligence suggesting Trump has already authorized tomorrow's strikes indicates that the decision-making process has advanced beyond deliberation into execution phase, with military units receiving final operational orders and commanders conducting pre-strike briefings. The fact that Netanyahu apparently learned of these plans through intelligence channels rather than direct American notification raises critical questions about coordination failures between Washington and Jerusalem, or alternatively suggests deliberate American decisions to minimize Israeli involvement in final planning stages, to preserve operational security, or maintain political flexibility. This briefing will examine several critical dimensions of this crisis. First, the specific intelligence that apparently triggered Netanyahu's emergency departure and what it reveals about American strike planning. Second, the operational timeline suggesting imminent military action and the forced deployments that corroborate strike preparations. Third, Netanyahu's desperate diplomatic mission to Washington and what outcomes he might realistically achieve given the advanced stage of American preparations. Fourth, the strategic calculations driving both American and Israeli positions as the moment of decision approaches. And finally, what this crisis reveals about the state of the U.S.-Israel alliance and the management of major military operations in an era of unprecedented geopolitical complexity. According to intelligence reporting that has been corroborated through multiple channels, Israeli intelligence services obtained classified American military communications indicating that President Trump signed final authorization for Iran strike operations during the evening of February 9, 2026, with execution orders transmitted to relevant combatant commands shortly thereafter. The operational orders reportedly specify H-hour for initial strikes as early morning February 11, 2026, Middle East time, providing approximately 36 to 48 hours from the moment Netanyahu's flight departed Tel Aviv. The intelligence assessment that reached Israeli leadership indicated that American B-2 Spirit stealth bombers had already departed Diego Garcia Air Base on pre-positioning flights, that carrier strike groups had moved into final launch positions, and that specialized ground units were conducting final equipment checks before insertion operations. The leaked materials reportedly include target lists exceeding 400 distinct strike objectives distributed across Iranian territory, with particular emphasis on deeply buried nuclear facilities at Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan that survived June 2025 operations. Intelligence assessments suggest the American strike plans incorporate recently delivered GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator weapons, specifically designed to destroy hardened underground bunkers, indicating intention to completely eliminate Iranian nuclear infrastructure rather than merely degrading capabilities as occurred during previous engagements. The comprehensive nature of the target lists, including not only nuclear-related sites but also ballistic missile production facilities, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps command centers, and naval bases controlling the Strait of Hormuz, suggests American planning for sustained operations extending potentially weeks rather than the limited strikes some analysts had anticipated. Israeli intelligence services reportedly identified the authorization through signals intelligence collection targeting American military communications networks, a capability that Israel maintains despite formal intelligence sharing agreements with Washington. The fact that Israel learned of final strike authorization through collection rather than direct American notification represents either catastrophic coordination failure or deliberate American operational security decisions to limit information distribution even to closest allies. Intelligence reporting suggests that when Israeli officials sought confirmation through official diplomatic channels, American counterparts provided only vague acknowledgments about ongoing contingency planning without confirming imminent operations, further alarming Israeli leadership about potential exclusion from final decision-making. The timing of the leaked intelligence, reaching Israeli leadership on February 9th, with strikes apparently scheduled for February 11th, provided only minimal window for diplomatic intervention. This compressed timeline reportedly drove Netanyahu's decision to abandon scheduled domestic activities and personally fly to Washington, calculating that direct personal appeal to President Trump represented Israel's only viable mechanism to influence American operational planning before forces initiated combat. The urgency reflected in the emergency flight arrangements, departing without full security protocols, conducting in-flight secure communications, and notifying Washington of arrival only after takeoff, indicates Israeli assessment that standard diplomatic processes could not move fast enough to affect decision-making on Trump's timeline. Independent analysis of American force deployments and operational patterns provides substantial corroboration for intelligence assessments, suggesting imminent military action. Satellite imagery analysts have documented the departure of multiple B-2 Spirit stealth bombers from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, with flight tracking data consistent with transit to forward operating locations in the Middle East theater. The B-2 platform represents America's primary delivery system for GBU-57 bunker-penetrating weapons, and its forward deployment typically occurs only in immediate pre-strike windows, given the aircraft's strategic value and vulnerability, while positioned at forward bases. Naval force dispositions also indicate advanced strike preparations. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, which had been operating in the northern Arabian Sea, moved into the Persian Gulf during the first week of February, positioning within optimal strike range of Iranian coastal targets. Additional carrier groups, including the USS Gerald R. Ford, have moved into supporting positions in the Red Sea and Eastern Mediterranean, creating overlapping strike coverage that would enable sustained operations while individual carrier groups rotate for replenishment. The concentration of 3 carrier strike groups within simultaneous strike range of Iranian territory represents force density not seen since the opening phases of the Iraq War in 2003. Air refueling tanker deployments provide additional indicators of imminent operations. Intelligence reporting documents the forward positioning of KC-135 and KC-46 aerial refueling aircraft at bases throughout the Gulf region. With deployment densities consistent with support requirements for sustained strike operations, involving hundreds of sorties per day. The presence of specialized tanker variants configured for stealth aircraft support indicates preparations for B-2 operations, as these bombers require dedicated refueling support given their unique operational characteristics. The positioning of these assets in final operating locations typically occurs only 72 to 48 hours before initial combat operations, consistent with strike timelines suggested by leaked intelligence. Ground force movements also align with imminent operations timeline. Intelligence assessments document the deployment of specialized units including combat search and rescue teams, explosive ordnance disposal personnel, and intelligence collection assets to forward operating bases in Iraq, Jordan, and undisclosed locations within range of Iranian territory. These forces provide critical support for strike operations including pilot recovery if aircraft are downed, post-strike battle damage assessment, and exploitation of intelligence opportunities created by combat operations. Their forward positioning represents final preparation steps that occur only when strike execution is imminent, and operational security considerations permit visible deployments. Diplomatic patterns provide additional corroboration. American embassies throughout the Middle East have issued updated security guidance to personnel, restricted travel authorizations, and in some cases begun limited drawdowns of non-essential staff. These measures typically precede major military operations by 48 to 72 hours, providing sufficient time for personnel movements while minimizing the risk that preparations themselves reveal operational timelines to adversaries. The coincidence of these diplomatic measures with military force deployments creates comprehensive operational picture consistent with strike operations scheduled for February 11th, timeframe indicated in leaked intelligence. Netanyahu's emergency flight to Washington represents desperate attempt to influence American decision-making at a point where substantive policy changes may no longer be achievable. When military forces have received execution orders, equipment has been pre-positioned, and commanders have conducted final briefings, Reversing operational momentum requires presidential decisions to abort missions that may already be underway. The political and military costs of canceling operations at advanced stages create powerful incentives to proceed, even if diplomatic considerations might suggest pause. Netanyahu's mission therefore faces extraordinarily difficult task, convincing Trump to either abort operations entirely or substantially modify operational parameters to address Israeli concerns, despite the advanced state of American preparations. Israeli concerns reportedly center on several specific issues that Netanyahu intends to raise during Washington meetings. First, Israel seeks assurance that American strikes will be sufficiently comprehensive to completely eliminate Iranian nuclear capabilities rather than merely degrading them, requiring follow-on operations. Israeli strategic doctrine holds that incomplete destruction of Iranian nuclear infrastructure creates worse outcomes than no strikes at all, as it provokes Iranian retaliation while leaving Tehran capable of rapid nuclear reconstitution once American attention shifts elsewhere. Netanyahu reportedly intends to present intelligence assessments arguing that proposed American target lists omit critical nuclear-related facilities, potentially leaving Iran capable of rebuilding enrichment capabilities within months. Second, Israel demands coordination on response planning for inevitable Iranian retaliation. Intelligence assessments suggest Iran will launch hundreds of ballistic missiles against Israeli territory in response to American strikes, similar to June 2025 retaliation patterns. Israel requires American commitment to provide additional missile defense assets, real-time intelligence sharing on Iranian launch preparations, and potentially American strikes on Iranian missile forces before they can launch retaliatory attacks. Netanyahu's emergency flight reflects Israeli concerns that current American operational planning inadequately accounts for Israeli defense requirements during the extended period when Iran will possess incentive and capability to strike Israeli cities. Third, Israel seeks American agreement to expand strike operations beyond nuclear facilities to include Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps infrastructure supporting proxy forces, including Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthi militants. Israeli strategic thinking holds that degrading Iranian nuclear capabilities, while leaving intact the conventional military infrastructure that supports regional proxies, creates imbalanced outcomes where Iran retains capacity to threaten Israel through asymmetric means even after losing nuclear options. Netanyahu reportedly intends to argue for expanded American target lists that systematically dismantle Iranian power projection capabilities across multiple domains simultaneously. The realistic assessment of what Netanyahu can achieve through this emergency intervention is sobering. Trump has demonstrated consistent willingness to act unilaterally on matters he considers vital American interests, and has previously dismissed allied concerns when they conflict with his policy preferences. The advanced state of operational preparations limits flexibility for major changes, as modifying target lists or operational sequences at this stage creates risks of confusion and mission failure. Netanyahu's best realistic outcome may be securing American commitments on missile defense support and intelligence sharing, rather than substantive changes to strike operations themselves. His worst outcome would be returning to Israel empty-handed, having demonstrated Israel's inability to influence American decision-making, even on matters of existential importance to Israeli security. Trump's decision to proceed with Iran strikes on compressed timeline, despite potential allied concerns, reflects multiple intersecting strategic calculations. Domestically, Trump faces midterm elections in November 2026, and demonstrating decisive action against Iran provides political benefits among constituencies that prioritize strong foreign policy and confrontation with hostile regimes. Polling data suggests public support for Iran operations, particularly if framed as preventing nuclear proliferation and protecting American interests. Executing strikes in February provides sufficient time for military success to consolidate into political advantages before November voting, while delays risk operational complications or change circumstances that could undermine political benefits. Operationally, Trump appears to calculate that current window offers uniquely favorable conditions for Iran strikes. Iranian air defenses remain degraded from June 2025 operations and have not fully reconstituted. Nuclear facilities remain partially damaged and vulnerable, and internal protests have weakened regime cohesion. Intelligence assessments suggest that delaying operations 6 months would allow Iran to rebuild capabilities to levels where strikes become significantly more difficult and dangerous. Acting now accepts diplomatic costs with allies like Israel in exchange for military advantages that improve operational success probabilities and reduce American casualties. Strategically, Trump's willingness to proceed despite Israeli concerns signals American intention to operate independently, even in Middle East, traditionally considered area of closest U.S.-Israel coordination. This represents significant shift from historical patterns where American presidents provided Israeli leadership with advance notification and consultation opportunities on major regional operations. Trump appears to calculate that demonstrating American independence strengthens rather than weakens the alliance by establishing that the United States acts according to its own strategic assessment rather than outsourcing decision-making to regional partners, regardless of how valued those partnerships might be. Netanyahu's desperate flight to Washington reflects Israeli calculations that exclusion from final American decision-making on Iran represents unacceptable strategic outcome regardless of whether Israeli intervention succeeds in modifying American plans. For Israeli domestic politics, Netanyahu cannot afford to appear passive or uninformed about American operations that will trigger Iranian retaliation against Israeli cities. Even if the emergency flight fails to change Trump's decisions, it demonstrates to Israeli constituencies that their leadership attempted every possible avenue to influence outcomes and protect Israeli interests. The optics of Netanyahu personally racing to Washington provides political cover against accusations of negligence or weakness, regardless of substantive results achieved. The circumstances surrounding Netanyahu's emergency flight illuminate significant tensions within the U.S.-Israel relationship that transcend the immediate Iran crisis. The fact that Israel learned of final American strike authorization through intelligence collection rather than direct notification represents either catastrophic communication failure or deliberate American decision to limit Israeli involvement in sensitive operational planning. Either explanation suggests serious problems in alliance management, as close allies traditionally provide advance notification and consultation opportunities on operations affecting mutual interests, even when final decisions rest with the acting power. American motivations for potentially excluding Israel from final planning stages could include multiple factors. Operational security concerns may drive decisions to minimize distribution of sensitive information, calculating that limiting knowledge reduces risks of leaks that could compromise mission success. Political considerations may influence American preferences to avoid situations where Israeli concerns could complicate or delay operations that Trump has determined serve American interests regardless of allied preferences. Strategic signaling may drive American decisions to demonstrate independence from Israeli influence, establishing precedents for future situations where Washington and Jerusalem interests might diverge. Israeli responses to perceived exclusion reflect fundamental uncertainties about the future trajectory of the alliance under Trump's leadership. If the United States proceeds with major military operations affecting Israeli security without substantive consultation, it raises questions about what other American decisions might occur without Israeli input or potentially contrary to Israeli preferences. This uncertainty drives Israeli calculations to demand maximum access and influence even at cost of diplomatic friction, as accepting marginalization in Iran operations could establish precedents that erode Israeli influence across broader range of American Middle East policy. Netanyahu's emergency flight to Washington represents last desperate attempt to influence American decision-making before military operations commence that will reshape Middle Eastern strategic landscape for decades. The leaked intelligence suggesting Trump has already ordered tomorrow's Iran strikes indicates that diplomatic intervention opportunities have narrowed to vanishing point, with military momentum carrying operations toward execution, regardless of allied concerns or diplomatic complications. The coming hours will reveal whether Netanyahu's personal intervention achieves substantive changes to American operational planning, or whether Israel must accept outcomes determined entirely by Washington's independent strategic assessment. What remains certain is that the Iran strikes will occur on American timeline according to American parameters, with Israeli concerns incorporated only to extent they align with pre-existing American operational preferences. The precedent established by Trump's willingness to proceed without comprehensive Israeli consultation will define alliance management patterns extending far beyond the immediate crisis, potentially reshaping expectations about how closely the United States coordinates with even its closest regional partners on matters of mutual strategic importance. Whether this represents temporary friction or fundamental realignment of the alliance will become clear only through sustained observation of American and Israeli behavior across subsequent regional challenges.